Another development are Apple's third quarter results hitting the tape. And let's go to Emily McCormick in our newsroom for a breakdown on the numbers. Emily.
All right, so it looks like a top-line beat for Apple. So revenue was $53.8 billion in the fiscal third quarter. That was above the $53.3 billion that consensus analysts were expecting, according to Bloomberg compiled data. Remember that before this quarter, Apple had reported 2 consecutive quarters of year-over-year declines on the top line. So this quarter actually snapping that trend. Then on the bottom line, we have earnings per share of $2.18 versus expectations for $2.10 expected. One thing that I do want to highlight here, iPhone revenue was $25.99 billion. So that actually comprised less than 50% of total sales for Apple. First time that's happened since 2012, according to Bloomberg data. We're going through the results right now, but it does look like that Apple shares are up about 3% in after hours trading. So the street is taking this report positively right out the gate.
Emily McCormick in the newsroom. So we're getting some of the numbers here, looking at gross margins, 37.5%. This is for the fourth quarter to 38.5%. The estimate there had been 37.7%. Also looking at fourth quarter revenue. So the next quarter, 61 to 64 billion versus the estimate of 61. First blush on these numbers for you.
Jen, they look in line. There's some puts and takes, and we'll go through the individual segments. But I think, broadly speaking, it demonstrates that the company's executing pretty well through what is a difficult environment.
How big is that headline on the iPhones? So the idea that this company that was tagged for so long as just being a one-trick pony, and here, the iPhone not comprising even half of the revenue. Is this the inflection point that investors have possibly been waiting for?
Well, I think it's exactly what Dan pointed to. This is a company that has been in transition, and it is starting to push. The numbers are starting to reflect that narrative that we've been hearing from Tim Cook, which is that it's not just a devices company. But what I think is kind of interesting, looking through the numbers here, Apple talks a lot about the importance of the Chinese market. China sales fell 4%, 9.16 billion is what we're looking at. Yes, it wasn't as much of the decline that we saw in the previous quarter, but this comes at a time when we're seeing Huawei increasingly taking the market share back home. And so while Apple can say, look, the tariff impact hasn't been as significant, at least on the iPhone side. It has had an impact on the sales side of things. And China has been a very important market, so I have to wonder, where's the slack going to come from? Are they going to be able to pick it up on the services side? We know there are additional services coming with, Apple TV Plus and some other, credit cards that Apple has talked about in terms of partnerships there. So I wonder if that is enough to make up the slack that they're losing overseas.
Dan, I want to get your take real quick on the services revenue number because it did hit another record. It rose 12.6% to $11.46 billion, but it did miss estimates. What do you make of that?
I think some of it could be tied to the fact that some services revenue ultimately is linked to unit sales in a given quarter. Could be some relative slowdown in parts of the App Store. Could be in China. We'll see if we get a little bit more color on the call. I think if we look out to where the services business is partly evolving towards, they're going to come out with new subscriptions for TV. Apple is working on content with luminaries, of course, like Steven Spielberg and Oprah. And so there's certainly some potential there for Apple to come out with differentiated content, which we think some of their users might be interested in. Additionally, you have areas like gaming. Of course, gaming is a big market. Apple's working on games. They already derive a lot of revenue from their App Store, from the gaming segment. So gaming is important to Apple today. I think with a new subscription, there's potential for some incremental revenue. So there's really no question that they have to keep pushing forward, innovating, investing. To your point, Jen, this obviously costs money. But the company, if we look back at their history and if we think about where they're going, they tend to be very long-term oriented. So it's not that a given quarter or two doesn't matter. Of course it does. But really, it's about trying to navigate and capitalize on these shifts and developments in the technology landscape. And really what Apple's been able to do quite well historically is to help drive them. I mean, if we think about the world before the iPhone, there were cell phones. But the iPhone really changed the paradigm, right, in terms of having the App Store. If we think about the wearables. There were watches before the Apple Watch arrived, of course. But what Apple is trying to do is really pull together the hardware, the software, and the services and really deliver a fun, secure experience. And just to maybe spend a moment on some of the things that they might be able to do over time in healthcare with the watch. Of course, pulling together the different constituents, the doctors, of course, the individual insurance companies. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle here, and Apple has an opportunity to, I think, participate in that over the next several years. So still a lot of interesting opportunities for them, but of course they have to capitalize on them.
And Tim Cook being pretty optimistic in the press release here, saying it was our biggest June quarter ever. Let's get a recap on the numbers that Apple delivered from Emily McCormick in the Yahoo Finance newsroom. Emily.
All right, so just to recap, we do have a beat on the top and bottom lines for Apple's fiscal third quarter. So again, on the top line, we have revenue coming in at $53.8 billion versus that $53.3 billion expected, and then earnings per share of $2.18 versus $2.10 expected. Just digging in a little bit more to the report here, I do want to call attention to the services revenue. So in the quarter, that was $11.46 billion, a new record. That was up from $10.2 billion in the year ago quarter, but did miss consensus expectations for as much as $11.95 billion in that service segment. Then if we look at China, which had been a weak spot for Apple over the past couple of quarters, we actually had net sales in that region fall just 4% over last year to $9.157 billion. That was much better than the quarter prior when we saw a 21.5% year-over-year decline, and then the quarter before that we saw a 26.7% year-over-year decline. And then finally, the Apple Watch in the wearables category has now actually topped the iPad in terms of sales. So that has really been an area of growth for Apple under Steve Jobs, and an area like services that the company has been trying to build out in the quarters to come.
Emily McCormick in the Yahoo Finance newsroom. So everybody kind of keying off that China number there coming in. You know, you thought that was pretty positive. Aikiko, you're just back from China. I mean, that number looks definitely to be consolidating in a much better space than just a few months ago for Apple.
Yeah, I mean, Tim Cook, at least according to this Reuters report, saying that they actually grew in mainland China. He says non-iPhone revenue grew 17%. We grew in every category outside of the iPhone. Going back to what you were mentioning earlier, Dan, I'm curious if the way that we view the services part of the business is changing, because historically, if you look at it, everything has been tied to the devices. But now we're talking about services like Apple TV Plus, which don't necessarily tie back to the watch, to the iPhone. Should investors start to look at that in a separate way? Because on the one hand, you look at the iPhone sales, sure, those have been declining along with the overall smartphone market. That's not a good sign because everything ties back to it. And yet we're seeing the growth on the services side. So how do you see the two?
I think what's really interesting, and this speaks to the broader transformation of the digital landscape that's going on. You really have the growth of content being created in new places. People are able to harness enormous power in the palm of their hand, an iPhone in this case. And so they're able to consume and use the products and services in new ways. So very specifically, I think what it's demonstrating, this growth in services, even though it wasn't as strong as people expected in this given quarter, the company has really developed a loyal following, and they've demonstrated to their users and to people who are potentially interested in the Apple ecosystem that Apple wants to get these experiences right. They want to do it in a way that is secure, that is maintaining people's privacy. They want to do it in a way that's local to different regions. Obviously, the China market is tremendously important, and even the growth this quarter, or the results this quarter, suggest that even with all the noise and the tension and the trade issues, Apple is doing a pretty good job. And I think what's interesting is, yes, and we keep coming back to iPhone, and it is important. even areas like iPad and Mac, markets that have long since, in a sense, been discarded. People view them as yesterday's market. Apple's still innovating. They recently came out with iPad OS to really try and take the iPad into newer areas and for newer workloads. And so, to me, this is a company that is continually looking at how to push things forward, how to be able to how to take its users what they need, try and come up with things that they think their users may want, and deliver it to them in a package, and then tie it all together in a fun way. And so, looking at these results and thinking about where they've been investing, it suggests that the company is making pretty good progress, and of course we'll continue to see what newer innovations come out of the company in the next year.
And right now we're watching Apple shares higher here in aftermarket hours, up just about 3% following those earnings that came in better than expected. Some good guidance, stabilizing trends in China.